Silas Vane swung his axe again, the silence of the high Rockies in the winter of 1838 pressing around him like a shroud. The only sound was the flat, metallic thunk of his blade biting into the frozen lodgepole pine, a sound that seemed to be swallowed by the snow before it could even echo. He was building his camp, and he was failing. The temperature was dropping with the sun, a relentless plunge into a cold, so profound it felt personal, an active malice from the landscape itself. His breath, which had been a plume of steam, was now freezing instantly to the ragged wool scarf tied around his face, and his fingers, even inside their fur-lined mittens, were aching inanimate things. He knew the signs. This was not the companionable cold of a crisp autumn morning. This was the blue cold, the kind that killed. He had perhaps an hour of usable daylight left, and his fire, the one he had spent the last 30 minutes trying to build, was a pathetic, smoky betrayal. It hissed and popped, a small, stubborn knot of embers, fighting a losing battle against the dampness of the wood and the suffocating pressure of the snow-laden air. The small flames that did rise were thin and yellow, offering no heat, only acrid smoke that stung his eyes and seemed to freeze in the air. He was doing it the way he'd been taught, the way every trapper at the rendezvous seemed to do it. A small pile of tinder, a teepee of kindling, and then the larger logs. But the snow was deep, and the ground beneath it was a frozen sponge. The fire's own heat was melting its foundation, drowning itself in a slurry of icy slush and ash. Silas kicked at the smouldering pile in frustration, scattering the precious embers, which died almost instantly on the snow with a sound like a dozen tiny sighs. He was alone, weeks from the nearest outpost, and the night was coming on. He looked at his half-built lean-to, a simple wall of pine boughs meant to reflect the fire's heat, and felt a creeping dread. What good was a reflector if the fire itself was a failure? He had good traps, a fine rifle, and a strong constitution, but none of those mattered if he couldn't solve this primary equation. The cold was a physical weight, and it was winning. He had seen men who had frozen, found them in the spring thaw, their faces calm and surprised, as if they had simply fallen asleep. He thought of his tinderbox, its smooth wooden surface warm in his pocket. It was his last defense, and it felt woefully inadequate. He had enough charcloth for a dozen more attempts, but he knew with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind that all 12 would fail in the same way. The problem wasn't his spark. The problem was the fire itself. He was building it wrong, and that simple, damning fact was going to be the end of him. The bitter memory of his first winter in these mountains, just 2 years prior, rose in his mind. He had arrived full of confidence, a strong Kentucky axe in his hand, and the conventional wisdom of the Ohio Valley in his head. Back there, a fire was a simple thing. You cleared the leaves, built a pile, and struck your flint. The rich, deciduous forests provided endless, high-quality hardwood that burned hot and long. But the Rockies were not the Ohio Valley. Here, the wood was almost exclusively pine, spruce, and fir, resinous, quick-burning, and often damp or frozen solid. That first winter, he had nearly perished from ignorance. He built his fires just as he was doing now, directly on the surface of the snowpack. He spent more time battling his own fire than he did trapping. He would get a blaze going, only to have it melt a 3-foot pit in the snow, the sides of which would then collapse inward, suffocating the flames. The heat, rather than radiating outward to warm his shelter, went in 2 directions. Straight up into the uncaring night sky, or straight down into the snow, creating a perpetually damp and unstable hearth. He was consuming wood at a ferocious rate, forcing him to spend hours every day cutting and hauling, only to shiver through the night in a cloud of smoke. His buckskins were perpetually damp, his food was poorly cooked, and his sleep was a fractured, shivering misery. He'd woken one morning to find his moccasins, which he'd set near the fire to dry, frozen as hard as iron ingots. It had taken him an hour of painful, agonizing work, rubbing them under his shirt against his own skin to thaw them enough to put on. He had tried every variation he could think of. He built the fire bigger, which only made it sink faster. He built it smaller, which offered no heat against the sub-zero wind. He built it in a trench, and the trench filled with smoke. He was exhausted, not just from the labor, but from the sheer, stubborn failure of a technology that was supposed to be fundamental. He was a man on the frontier, a place defined by its reliance on axe and rifle, and his axe was failing him because his fire, the engine of all survival, was broken. The frustration had built into a quiet despair. He watched the Ute and the Shoshone, saw the thin, efficient plumes of smoke from their lodges, and knew they possessed a knowledge he lacked. They moved through this same cold, yet they seemed to belong to it in a way he did not. They were not fighting the winter, they were using it. He was just a cold, angry interloper, wasting his strength, burning through his resources, and slowly freezing to death, all because he couldn't make a simple firework when it mattered most. That spring, at the rendezvous on the Green River, he had sought out Jedediah Hayes. Jedediah was a legend, a man who had been in the mountains since before Lewis and Clark, a man who had lived for years with the Crow and spoke their language better than he spoke English. Silas found him sitting by his fire, mending a trap, the smoke rising in a clean, straight line. Silas, swallowing his pride, finally asked. "Jed," he'd said, his voice rough, "I can't keep a fire, not in the deep snow. It drowns itself. I'm burning 3 times the wood I'm trapping, and I'm still cold." Jedediah looked up slowly, his eyes nestled in a web of sun-scorched wrinkles, appraising Silas for a long moment. He spat a stream of tobacco juice. "That's 'cause you're building a fool's fire, son," Jedediah rasped. "You're trying to heat the ground. The ground don't care. It's got all the cold in the world in it." He pointed at his own fire with the trap. "Looky here. What do you see?" Silas looked. Jedediah's fire was not large, but it was bright, white-hot at the center, and it was clean. It wasn't sitting on the ground. It was built on a platform of 3 thick green aspen logs laid side by side. "You built it on a raft," Silas said, the realization dawning. "Aye," Jedediah nodded. "Green wood, or wet wood, or punky wood. Don't matter. So long as it's thick. It'll char, but it won't burn through for morning. You get your fire off the snow. The snow is a thief, boy. It'll steal your heat and give you nothing but steam." He then pointed behind the fire, where he had driven 2 stakes and piled a short, tight wall of logs. "And what's that?" Silas asked. "That's the other half of your fire," Jedediah said. "A fire throws its heat in all directions. You're only sitting on one side. That wall catches all the heat that's trying to escape and throws it right back where you want it. On your face, on your lean-to. You build a floor, and you build a back. Then you ain't just lighting a fire, you're aiming it." Silas also learned from watching the land itself. He saw how a lightning-struck tree would smolder for days, its heat concentrated in the dry duff under the log, protected from the wind. He noticed how the wind, his greatest enemy, would also feed a fire if channeled, how a small gap at the base of a blaze would create a draft, making it burn hotter and cleaner. The fire wasn't just wood, it was a system. It was a structure of fuel, air, and reflection. That night, Silas Vane stopped thinking about his fire as a pile. He began to think of it as a machine. From that day forward, Silas Vane's preparations for winter changed completely. It was no longer a desperate scramble for any wood. It became a methodical, deliberate process of engineering. Before the first snows even threatened, in the late golden days of autumn, he began to prepare his kit. His tinderbox was still the heart of it, but its contents became more specialized. He didn't just carry char cloth. He spent days gathering birch bark, peeling it into paper-thin sheets that would catch a spark instantly. He harvested the dry, black fungus that grew on the side of dead aspens, pounding it into a fine, flammable dust. His most prized possession, however, was his fatwood pouch. He would hunt for the stumps of long-dead pines where the resin had pooled and hardened in the core, creating a wood so saturated with turpentine it was waterproof and would light even in the rain. He'd split these pine knots into a bundle of small, precise sticks, each one a guaranteed flame. This was his ignition. But the real change was in his thinking. He no longer saw the forest as just fuel. He saw it as a collection of components. When he made camp for the night, he didn't just drop his pack and start cutting. He would spend 10, sometimes 15 minutes just observing. Where was the wind coming from? He needed to put his back to it. Where was the natural shelter? A high rock face, a dense thicket of spruce, a deep drift. All these could serve as his reflector wall, saving him the labor of building one. Then he would begin the build, and it was always in the same ritualistic sequence. He would clear the snow, not in a wide, useless circle, but in a long, narrow rectangle, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, pointing directly at his intended shelter. He was defining the space of his machine. He would use his axe to cut 2 thick base logs, preferably from a damp-down tree, wood that would resist burning. He laid these parallel on the cleared ground at the far end of his rectangle. Then he would cut 3 or 4 smaller logs and lay them perpendicular across the base logs, creating a raised grate or platform. This was Jedediah's floor. It was the single most important part. This platform, standing a good 6 inches above the frozen earth, would ensure his fire never touched the snow. It would allow air to be drawn in from underneath, feeding the very heart of the combustion. Only then, with the platform built and the reflector wall in place, either natural stone or a stacked wall of green logs behind it, would he even think about his Tindex box. He was building a furnace, not a bonfire. The construction of the fire itself became an act of precision. On top of the log platform, he would lay his tinder, a small, loose nest of birch bark shavings and fungus dust, with a single resinous stick of fatwood at its center. Around this, he built a small, airy log cabin of his driest kindling, twigs snapped from the underside of dead pines, wood that had never touched the snow. He stacked them in a square Lincoln log style, leaving gaps for air. Then he laid his larger split fuel wood on top of that. The entire structure was built before the spark. There was no desperate blowing on a dying ember, no feeding a weak flame with damp twigs. He was assembling a complete system, ready for activation. When the structure was complete, he would kneel, pull his tinderbox from his shirt, and strike his flint against the steel. A bright spark would leap onto the black, sensitive charcloth, glowing instantly into a red, creeping cherry. He'd place this glowing cloth into the heart of the tinder nest, cup his hands around it, and blow. Not hard, but a long, steady, patient breath. The effect was immediate. The tinder would erupt in a clean, white flame, which would instantly ignite the fat wood. The fat wood, in turn, would roar to life, acting like a torch, igniting the kindling log cabin from the inside out. The draft, created by the platform, would suck air from below, pulling the flames upward into the main fuel logs. Within 60 seconds, Silas would have what had eluded him for years, a stable, roaring and intensely hot fire. There was almost no smoke. The combustion was so efficient, so complete, that all the wood's energy was being converted into heat and light. And the heat, blocked by the reflector wall, had nowhere to go but forward. It struck his lean-to, it warmed his body, it heated the very air in his small rectangle of cleared earth, creating a microclimate of survival. Neighbors and fellow trappers, when they stumbled upon his camp, were mystified. They saw him sitting comfortably, often in just his shirt sleeves, mending his gear in a bubble of warmth, while they shivered in their own smoky, hissing pits. They mocked him at first. "Look at Vane, building a throne for his fire," one had joked. But the mockery stopped when they saw his woodpile. He used, by his own estimation, less than half the wood they did. While they were spending their nights constantly feeding their hungry, inefficient fires, Silas's fire, raised on its platform, would burn hot and steady for hours, the logs slowly collapsing into a perfect, concentrated bed of coals on the charring platform below. The true test came during the Great Blizzard of 1840. It was a storm that came without warning, a blue norther that rolled down from the Arctic, dropping the temperature from 20 degrees above zero to 40 below in a single afternoon. Silas was caught on an exposed ridge, miles from any real shelter. The wind was a physical wall, driving snow so thick he couldn't see his own feet. His horse, laboring in the deepening drifts, was coated in ice, its own breath freezing to its muzzle. This was not a night to be cold. This was a night to die. He knew he had perhaps 30 minutes of functional dexterity left before his hands became useless claws. He found a small indentation in the landscape, a shallow bowl where a great pine had been uprooted years before. The root ball and the trunk provided a V-shaped windbreak. It was not much, but it was enough. He slid from his horse, his movements frantic but not panicked. He did not have time to build a proper reflector, so he used the landscape. He would build his fire against the massive snow-covered root ball. He tethered his horse close, using its body as another windbreak. Then the ritual began. He dug with his snowshoes, clearing the platform space. His axe rang against the frozen wood, the impacts jarring his arms to the shoulder. He cut his base logs, his platform logs. He fumbled in his pouch for his fat wood, his fingers already stiff and clumsy. The wind screamed, trying to steal his tindit. He shielded the small nest with his own body, his back to the gale. He struck the steel, once, twice. A spark caught. He blew, his lungs burning from the cold air. A flame, a tiny, precious, wavering flame. He placed it under the platform. For a heart-stopping second, the wind seemed to smother it, but the platform did its work. It shielded the flame from the snow and drew the air in, feeding the nascent fire. The fat wood caught, then the kindling. The blaze roared to life, the draft from the windbreak pulling the flames into a vortex. The root ball, caked in snow, began to steam and hiss, and then, as it dried, it became the perfect reflector. A wave of heat, intense and glorious, washed over Silas. He was shaking violently, the first stages of hypothermia already upon him, but he forced himself to build a quick lean-to. He staked his horse blanket to create a low roof, trapping the heat in his small shelter. That night, Silas Vane and his horse survived in a pocket of life, while the world outside them was being rendered sterile by the cold. The wind sounded like a freight train, and trees snapped in the forest like gunfire. But inside his shelter, the radiated heat from his engineered fire was so effective that the snow on his blankets melted. He was warm. He was alive. His fire had not been an act of desperation. It had been an act of engineering. In the years that followed, Silas Vane's raised fire became a legend. At the rendezvous, and later in the small settlements that began to spring up in the valleys, the technique was passed along. It was no longer Vane's fire. It was just the way. Young men, new to the mountains, were taught the method as gospel. Get it off the snow, give it a back and let it breathe from its belly, the old-timers would say, quoting a wisdom whose source they had long forgotten. Ben Kirby, a young man who had joined a trapping brigade in 1841, had been one of those who learned from Silas directly. He had watched, skeptical, as Silas built his altar, only to be humbled when his own fire sank and died, while Silas's blazed. Ben took the lesson to heart. Years later, Ben Kirby would lead a wagon train of settlers over the South Pass, and when they were caught in an early, vicious snowstorm, he saved 30 souls by organizing the men to build not one, but 3 massive Vane-style reflector fires. They circled the wagons, used the wagon beds themselves as reflectors, and kept the entire party from freezing. The innovation spread, adapting to new contexts. Settlers building their first crude cabins adopted the principle. Instead of building their fireplaces with a flat-back wall, they learned to build them with an angled fireback, a slope of stone or iron that did exactly what Silas's log wall had done. It radiated the heat out into the room rather than letting it escape up the chimney. The simple hunter's fire, designed for a temporary camp, had become the foundation for domestic comfort and efficiency. The legacy was written in saved lives and reduced labor. A fire that burned twice as hot on half the fuel meant a family could survive a winter with their woodpile intact. It meant less time spent felling trees and more time hunting, mending, or fortifying their homes. It was a multiplier of human energy, a simple, profound innovation that had been born from one man's cold, desperate frustration. The technique became part of the vernacular knowledge of the frontier, a piece of hard-won wisdom that proved the difference between surviving and thriving. The genius of Silas Vane's fire lay in its intuitive grasp of thermodynamics, principles that would not be formally codified by scientists for decades. The standard primitive fire was a slave to 3 invisible thieves: conduction, convection, and radiation. Silas, through observation and the mentoring of Jedediah Hayes, had systematically defeated all 3. The problem of circuit conduction, the direct transfer of heat to the cold, wet ground, was solved by the platform. By lifting the fire off the snow, he created an air gap. Air is a poor conductor of heat, while snow and ice are massive heat sinks. The platform insulated the fire from the ground, ensuring that its energy was not being stolen, by the earth. The problem of convection, the movement of heat through air, was solved by the same platform. A fire on the ground must draw its oxygen from the sides, often competing with its own smoke. The raised platform created a chimney effect, allowing cold, oxygen-rich air to be drawn in from below. This fed the very base of the fire, resulting in far more complete combustion. This is why his fire was so hot and produced so little smoke. It was a high-efficiency furnace, not a smouldering heap. Finally, and most critically, he solved the problem of irradiation. A fire radiates heat in all 360 degrees. A man sitting in front of it is receiving, at best, only a fraction of its total energy. The reflector wall, whether made of stone, green logs, or the root ball of a fallen tree, captured the vast percentage of heat that was radiating away from the shelter and bounced it back. This simple trick effectively doubled the fire's useful output, focusing its power onto the user like a lens. The mountain men, without knowing the Latin names for these principles, had become masters of applied physics. They were engineers of heat in the most hostile laboratory on Earth. Their solutions were not written in textbooks. They were written in survival, in the pragmatic, life-saving design of a fire that turned the bitter, killing cold into a manageable, even comfortable companion. Silas Vane lived to see the beaver trade collapse, and the mountains fill with miners, ranchers, and settlers. He aged, his hands gnarled from a lifetime of cold and work, but he never lost the methodical precision of his actions. He was known as a quiet man, one who watched the newcomers build their big, wasteful cabins and their roaring, inefficient fires with a kind of sad patience. He had learned a truth in the high snows that few of them understood. He had learned that survival was not a matter of brute force. It was not about cutting more wood or building a bigger blaze. It was a matter of design. It was about understanding the unseen forces at play, the flow of air, the path of heat, the thieving nature of the cold, and working with them, not against them. His tinderbox, which he carried until his death, was a symbol of this compact. It was a tool of preparation, a testament to the idea that the work done before the crisis was what determined the outcome. The fat wood he gathered in the sun of September was the life he saved in the darkness of January. What he had built on that ridge was not just a fire, it was a solution. He had taken the most chaotic and destructive force in nature, combustion, and contained it, tamed it, and aimed it. In the end, the story of that fire is the story of all human innovation. It is about the courage to see that the way it's always been done is wrong. It is about the humility to learn from failure, from the wisdom of others, and from the quiet lessons of the natural world. It is the realization that a good design, a thoughtful preparation, is the highest form of respect one can pay to a harsh environment. It is the understanding that what separates us from the chaos is not our strength, but our ability to think, to plan, and to create a small, warm circle of order in the heart of the wild.